The auction sign went up on a Tuesday, and the dog stopped sleeping that same night. Walt Brenner noticed it the way he noticed everything that broke pattern, which was to say without surprise and without delay. He had run the place 41 years. He knew the sound of his own land settling in the dark, the tick of the propane line, the way the windbreak hissed when the air came down off the ridge. He knew what his dog did at night, which was nothing, which was sleep flat against the mudroom door, with one ear cocked and the rest of him gone. That Tuesday, the dog stood at the glass at 2 a.m. and would not lie back down, and Walt sat up in the dark and listened and heard the thing he had spent a lifetime not hearing, which was the absence of any other sound at all. He did not get up right away. He was 73, and his knees told him about every cold front a day before it came. And a man learns to spend his standing carefully. He lay in the bed his wife had died in 2 winters back, and he counted the quiet. No coyotes off the South 40. No owls. The pole barn usually held a barn cat or two that fought at this hour, and there was nothing from the pole barn. He thought about the for sale by owner sign he had driven into the gravel at the end of the lane that afternoon, the auctioneer's number printed under it, and he thought, with the flat practicality of a man who had decided a hard thing and meant to see it done, that the sign and the silence had nothing to do with each other. He told himself that he was good at telling himself things. It had kept him going for 2 years. The dog was a heeler named Sue, 11 years old, gone gray at the muzzle and stiff in the back, and she had never once in her life cried at a window. She was crying now, not loud. A thin sound pushed out through a closed throat, the sound a dog makes when it wants to bark, and has decided that barking is a bad idea. Walt got his feet under him and went to the mudroom in his sock feet and stood beside her and looked out at his own yard, which he had looked out at 10,000 mornings, and saw nothing he could name. The yard light threw its cone over the gravel turnaround. The grain bins stood where they had stood since 1986. Past the reach of the light, the dark started, and the dark had a quality that night he did not have a word for. A thickness, as if the air past the fence line had been packed in tighter than air should pack. Sue would not put her nose to the glass. That was the thing he kept coming back to later. A dog noses a window. It is the most natural act a dog performs, to press the wet of its nose to the cold of the glass and read whatever is out there. Sue held her head back a full hand's width from the pane and stared and shook, and Walt understood, in a way he could not have defended to another living soul, that whatever was in his yard was something his dog did not want to get any closer to, even through a 1/4 inch of glass. He put his hand on her back. The hair stood under his palm in a hard ridge from her shoulders to her tail. He waited. He was a patient man, and the night was long, and he had nowhere to be in the morning, except the same place he had been every morning, which was here on the ground his grandfather had broke. The ground he was about to sign away, because his body would not let him farm it, and his son would not come back to farm it. And there was no version of the future where the place stayed his. He waited at the glass with his hand on the dog, and after a long while, the ridge of hair went down, and Sue let out a breath and lay down. Not by the door, but pressed against Walt's ankles in the middle of the floor, as far from every wall of the house as she could get. In the morning he went out to look. This was the part he could trust. The looking, ground did not lie. He had read ground his whole life, read it for moisture and for traffic and for the passage of deer and coyote and the neighbor's loose cattle, and a thing that had been in his yard would have left the yard marked. He walked the turnaround in the gray light with his coffee going cold in the dented steel cup he had carried since the Carter administration, and he found the place where the gravel gave way to the worn dirt along the fence, and he stopped. There was a track in the soft dirt, one clean track, and the partial of a second. He set the cup down on a fence post and got down on one knee, which cost him, and he looked at it the way he would look at any sign, which was to ask it what made it and where it was going. The track was longer than his boot, and his boot was a 12. It had toes, 4 of them forward and a 5th set back and high, and at the front of each toe a deep narrow gouge where a claw had gone in and dragged. The pad of it was not a dog's pad, and not a cat's. It pressed deeper at the heel than at the toe, which meant weight carried back, which meant the thing had been standing still when it made the print. Standing and bearing down, the way a man bears down when he leans to look in a window. Walt was not a fanciful man. He had no use for the stories the hunters told at the co-op, the lights in the timber, the things that screamed in the river bottom. He had spent 73 years on this exact patch of the world, and never once seen anything he could not account for. So he did what he had always done. He started down the ladder of reasonable explanations, rung by rung, and he meant to climb all the way to the bottom and set both feet on solid ground. A big dog. Somebody's loose shepherd, a mastiff, one of those wide-jawed things the new people kept. He measured the track against his hand, spreading his fingers, and the track was wider than his spread hand, and the claw drag put it past anything a dog foot did. A dog's claws did not gouge like that, and a dog did not stand its weight back. On its heel had a window. He set that rung. A sight of bear, then they were not common. This far out on the flat, but they wandered, came down the river corridor in a bad mast year, looking for corn and garbage. He had seen bear sign twice in his life, and he knew it. The round heel and the 5 short claws, and the inward turn of the track. This was not that. The toes were too long, and there were not enough of them carrying weight. And the back set toe sat too high. And the whole architecture of the foot was wrong, was built for something that did not move the way a bear moved. He set that rung aside too, and he stood up with his knee, complaining. And he found he had run out of rungs faster than he had ever run out of them before, and he was still a long way from the ground. He did the thing a careful man does. He went and got his tape and his phone, and he documented it. He laid the tape beside the clear track, and the print ran 11 inches from heel to the tip of the longest claw drag. He photographed it from above and from the side, with the tape and frame, and he photographed the partial. And he noted to himself the stride, because the partial was farther from the clean track than any animal that size should have placed its next foot. He paced it off. The distance from the one track to the next was near 5 feet. Whatever had stood at his fence had crossed to the next print in a single unhurried step that spanned 5 feet of ground, and it had done it without disturbing the dirt between, which meant it had lifted clean and come down clean, which meant control, which meant something Walt did not want to follow to its end. He called the county that afternoon. He was not a man who called anyone. He had fixed his own machinery and set his own bones twice and buried his own wife with the help of nobody but the funeral home and the Lutheran minister, but he called the county sheriff's dispatch, and he told the woman who answered that he had a large animal on his property, predator sign, and he would like someone to come look at it. She was polite. She took his name and his address. She asked if the animal was threatening livestock or persons at the present time, and Walt said no, not at the present time. And she said in that case it would be a non-emergency, and an officer would come by when one was free, and that might be a day or two. Walt said no. He hung up the wall phone in the kitchen and stood with his hand still on it and looked out the window over the sink at the fence line. And he understood that no officer was coming in a day or two, and that if one came, he would find nothing but a track in the dirt. And the officer would write down what kindness required him to write down. And he would drive back to town, and that would be the end of the county. That was the first night, the Tuesday. There were 2 more. Walt made his supper the way he made it every night, which was poorly and without interest, eggs and toast and a can of something, and he ate standing at the counter because the table was too big with only 1 chair pulled out. He had stopped sitting at the table the week after the funeral and never started again. He fed Sue, and she would not eat until he carried her bowl to the middle of the kitchen, away from the door, and even then she ate fast, with her body turned to watch the glass. He banked the stove. He checked the latches on the doors the way he checked them every night, the mudroom in the front that nobody used, and the cellar bulkhead. And he found them all as he had left them, and that should have settled him and did not. He sat up later than he meant to. There was a chair by the front window where Marian used to sit with her crossword and her bad lamp, and he sat in it now, though he never had before because it gave him a line on the yard and the lane, and he sat there with the lamp off and the shotgun he had not fired in a decade leaned against the wall within reach because a man prepares, because preparing was the only thing left that he knew how to do. He did not expect to use it. He told himself he did not expect to use it. He sat and watched the cone of the yard light and the dark past it, and somewhere around 1 a.m, the dark past it moved. It did not move the way a thing crossing a yard moves. It moved the way a curtain moves, when something behind it shifts, a settling and a slide of greater dark, within the dark, out past the grain bins where the light did not reach. He had sat still in a deer blind through whole frozen mornings, and he knew how to make himself into furniture. And he made himself into furniture now, and he watched the place where the dark had moved. He waited for it to move again. Sue was under his chair. He could feel her against the legs of it, shaking, making no sound at all, and the no sound was worse than the crying had been. For a long time nothing happened, and then the yard light buzzed and dimmed the way it did when something drew on the line, when the well pump kicked, or the freezer cycled, except the well pump was not running, and the freezer had cycled an hour ago, and the light browned down to a dull orange coal, and in the failing of it, Walt saw the shape at the edge of the grain bins resolve just enough to have an outline and no more. It stood upright. That was the fact his mind kept trying to refuse, and kept failing to refuse. It stood upright against the curve of the bin, taller than the access door set in the bin's side, and he knew the height of that door because he had cut it himself, and the door was 6.5 feet to its top, and the shape stood a head and shoulders above it. Then the light came back up to full, and the space beside the bin was empty, and the dark past the bins was only dark. He did not sleep. He sat in Marian's chair until the gray came up over the eastern fence and the yard filled with ordinary morning, and the dog came out from under the chair and went to the door and was a dog again, and Walt got up on legs that had gone dead and stiff, and he went out to look, because the looking was the only ground he had left to stand on. The thing had been beside the grain bins. He went to the grain bins. He found, in the dust along the bin's foundation, a place where the dust had been swept clean in a broad arc, the way a heavy tail or a dragging hand would sweep it, and he found 4 parallel grooves cut into the steel of the bin's side, and he reached up and put his fingers in them, and they were above his head. He was 5'10" in his boots. The grooves started near 8 feet up and ran down to 6, and they were evenly spaced. and the spacing was the spacing of 4 fingers on a hand that was twice the size of his. He stood there with his fingers in the grooves a long time. The reasonable ladder was gone. There was no rung left that bore weight. He was a man who had built his whole life on the principle that the world made sense if you looked at it long enough and hard enough, and he was looking at it now as hard as he had ever looked at anything. And it did not make sense. It felt like a door opening onto a room. He had been told all his life was not there. He thought about Marion. He thought about how she would have wanted him to handle this. And he knew she would have wanted him to leave, to drive into town and stay at the motel by the highway until the place sold and let it be somebody else's ground and somebody else's dark. And he thought about how he was not going to do that. And he examined the reason. And the reason was not pride, and was not stubbornness, though he had both in quantity. The reason was that this was his ground for 3 more nights, and a man did not leave his ground to a thing like this. On the last nights it was his, did not hand it over already haunted, did not let the buyer's family move in over the top of whatever this was. He did not have the words for any of that. What he had was the certainty, flat and total, that he would be in Marion's chair again tonight. With the shotgun against the wall, he called the county a second time, a different woman. He gave his name and address, and she found the first call in the system and read it back to him. Large animal, predator sign, non-emergency. And she said it looked like it was still in the queue, and she was sorry for the wait. And they were short officers this week. Walt said he had new sign. He said it had been at his grain bins in the night and left marks on the steel, 8 feet off the ground. There was a small silence on the line, the particular silence of a person deciding how to talk to an old man who was alone on a farm and had maybe started to come apart, and Walt heard the silence and knew it for what it was, and he said never mind, and he hung up. He was not angry at her. So she was doing the only thing the system let her do, which was to wait for the animal to threaten persons or livestock at the present time. And Walt understood with a cold clarity that by the time it did either of those things, the time for an officer to drive out would be past. He spent the day getting ready in the only ways he knew. He filled the truck. He set the shotgun shells on the windowsill by Marion's chair, a row of them brass up. And he checked the barrels and the action, and he loaded it and leaned it where it had leaned. He brought Sue's bed in from the mudroom and set it in the middle of the front room. He moved the chair an inch, so the line to the lane was clean. These were small things, and he knew they were small, and he did them anyway. Because a man heads off weather and chance, and rust the only ways he can, and because the alternative to doing small things was sitting still with the size of the thing he could not do. The neighbor came by in the afternoon. Del Hovick farmed the section to the east and had farmed it as long as Walt had farmed his. And the two of them had the friendship of men who had loaned each other equipment for 50 years and said maybe 400 words a year. Del pulled his truck into the turnaround and rolled the window down and did not get out. And Walt came over and put his hands on the door, and they talked about the auction a while, the date, the equipment list, who might bid. Then Del looked off toward the grain bins and was quiet and said, "You been hearing anything out here at night?" Walt said, "Why?" Del said his own dogs had been bad 3 nights running, would not go past the yard light, and he had found a calf down in the far lot. Not killed for eating, just killed. The neck of it, and he had told himself it was a cat off the river, but he had not believed himself. He said it the way a proud man says a thing he is ashamed to be saying fast and flat, looking at the bins and not at Walt. Walt said he had sign in his yard he could not account for. Dell nodded slow, like that confirmed something he had not wanted. Confirmed, he said. You got that scattergun loaded. Walt said he did. Dell said it won't be enough, and then looked like he wished he had not said it, and rolled his window up and backed out. And that was the most either of them had ever said to the other about anything that mattered. It won't be enough. Walt turned that over, the rest of the day. Dell was not a man given to drama any more than Walt was. For Dell to say a thing like that, Dell had seen something or felt something that had reached past 50 years of plain talk and made him say the truest scared thing a farmer can say, which is that the tool will not be equal to the work. 1. Walt cleaned the shotgun again. Anyway, there was nothing else to clean. The second night came down slow, the way the long nights do in the fall. The light going copper and then ash and then gone. And Walt sat in Marion's chair with Sue at his feet, and the shotgun across his knees and the row of brass on the sill, and he waited. He had decided he would not make himself furniture tonight. He would watch openly. If the thing was as smart as the sign said it was, then it knew he was in the house, and knew where, and there was no use pretending to be a chair for something that had already counted the chairs. The yard, light brown down at midnight. This time he was ready for it, and he did not flinch, and in the long orange dimming, he watched the shape come not from the grain bins, but from the windbreak on the north, come low and then rise, unfold upward to its full standing height in a single motion that no animal he had ever watched could perform. The motion of a thing that went on 2 legs by choice and not by trick. It crossed the turnaround into the failing cone of the light, and for the length of perhaps 3 seconds, Walt Brenner saw it clearly. And he made himself look, because the looking was who he was, and he would not give that up even now, even to this. It stood near 8 feet, the legs bent backward at the joint like a dog's hind legs, and carried it forward at the hip like a man's. The chest was deep, and the shoulders rode high and forward, and the arms hung long, longer than the proportion of any upright thing, and ended in hands or in feet, built like hands, with the long toes and the claws he had measured in the dirt. The head was wrong on the body, low and pushed forward off the shoulders, and the muzzle was long, and the ears stood up off the skull and turned, tracking, one toward the house and one toward the road, independent of each other. The eyes caught the dying light and threw it back amber, a flat, reflective amber with no white around it, set forward in the skull the way a hunter's eyes are set forward, and they were aimed at the window where Walt sat, and they were not startled, and they were not curious. They were measuring. That was the word that came to him and would not leave. The thing in his yard was taking his measure the way he would take the measure of a problem in a field, weighing it, gauging the labor it would cost, and finding the cost acceptable. He did not raise the gun. Some part of him below the part that thought understood that raising the gun would change the nature of the next 3 seconds, and that he was not ready for what those seconds would become. And so he sat with the weight of the barrel across his knees, and his hand on the grip, and he held the amber eyes with his own. The light hung at its dull coal, and the thing stood in the turnaround 40 feet from the glass, and the two of them regarded each other across the worn dirt of a place that had been Walt's for 41 years. Then the head tilted. A slow, articulate tilt, the head going over to one side the way a man tilts his head when he has understood a thing and is deciding what to do about it. And the long ears came forward, both of them, both aimed at Walt now, and the light came up to full. The turnaround was empty. He sat in the chair until dawn, with the gun across his knees, and did not move and did not sleep. and Sue did not come out from under him until the sun was full up over the fence. The morning was clear and cold and ordinary and proved nothing at all. Walt went out when his legs would carry him, and he walked the turnaround and found the tracks. A line of them now, the 5-foot stride, crossing the dirt to the place it had stood, and then no more. And he stood over the last clean print a long while, with the cold coffee going colder in the steel cup. And he did not try to explain it because he had nothing left to explain it with. He did not call the county again. He drove into town instead in the full safe light of the middle of the day. And he went to the co-op where the old men sat. And he sat with them at the table by the seed rack, the way he had not sat since Marion got sick, and he listened. He did not say what he had seen. He let the talk find its own way, and after a while it found the timber and the river bottom the way it always did. And one of them, Arlen Pruitt, who was older than Walt and had trapped the river his whole life, said a thing low into his coffee that the others let pass and Walt did not. Arlen said his granddad had a name for the thing that came out of the bottom in a hard year. And you did not say the name, and you did not shoot at it because shooting at it was a way of telling it you were worth the trouble. And the only thing to do was be still and be quiet and let it decide on its own. Walt asked him, careful, what made it come up out of the bottom? Arlen looked at him, then really looked, the way Dell had looked, and said, change. It comes when the ground changes hands. It comes to the places where somebody is leaving. And then Arlen seemed to hear himself, and laughed it off and said he was an old fool, full of his granddad's stories, and the talk moved on. And Walt drove home in the failing light with the thing Arlen had said sitting in his chest like a stone. It comes to the places where somebody is leaving. The auction was in 2 days. The sign stood at the end of the lane. Walt had spent 2 years deciding to drive that sign into the gravel, and he had done it on Tuesday, and on Tuesday night. The dog had stood at the glass, and he understood now, or believed he understood, that the thing had not come because the farm was haunted ground or cursed ground or any other word the hunters used. It had come because the ground was changing hands, and because a thing that lived by reading the land had read the land and read the leaving in it the same way. Walt read a track and had come to the place where the leaving was strongest to see what the leaving left behind. He did not know if any of that was true. He knew it fit the facts better than anything the reasonable ladder had offered him, and a man who has run out of reasonable explanations will take an unreasonable one that fits the facts over no explanation at all, because the alternative is to stand in the dark with nothing. And Walt had stood in the dark with nothing for 2 years already, and he was tired of it. The third night he did not sit in Marion's chair. He had thought about it all the last day while he loaded the truck for the final time and walked the buildings and put his hand on the cold steel of the machines that would belong to other men by the weekend. And he had come to a decision that he could not have explained to Dell or to the county or to his own son if his son had called, which his son had not. The thing had taken his measure twice and had not come closer than 40 feet, and Walt had come to believe, in the place where he kept the certainties he could not defend, that the thing was waiting for him to do one of 2 things. It was waiting for him to run, which would tell it he was prey, or to shoot, which Arlen said would tell it he was worth the trouble. And Walt did not intend to do either. He intended to do the third thing, the thing that was neither flight nor fight, the thing a man does on his own ground, on the last night it is his. He went out. He took the shotgun because leaving it would have been a different kind of statement, and he was not making that statement either, but he carried it broken open over his arm the way you carry a gun you do not mean to fire, and he walked out past the yard light, into the dark past it, out to the fence line where the first track had been. And he stood on his own ground in the full dark, with his dog refusing to follow past the light behind him, and he waited. The cold came up, out of the dirt through his boots, The stars were hard. He could smell the place, the dust and the dry corn and the cold iron smell of the coming frost, the smell of 41 Octobers, and he stood in it and he waited for the thing to come and take his measure one last time. It came from the windbreak. He heard it before he saw it, and what he heard was not a growl exactly, was a layered sound, a low rolling rumble down under the floor of hearing, and over the top of it a faster broken vibration. Two sounds braided into one, the sound of something whose throat was built different than any throat he knew. The sound came across the dark, and Walt felt it in his sternum before he placed it in his ears, and every animal part of him that 73 years of being a calm man had built over told him to run, and he did not run. He had decided to stand, and he stood, and the shape came out of the windbreak, and rose to its height, and crossed toward him through the dark the dog would not enter, and stopped. Close now, closer than it had ever come, close enough that he could hear the working of its breath under the braided sound and smell it. A wet, rank carrion smell laid over with something colder, and he looked up at the place where its eyes would be, and found the amber already fixed on him. They stood that way a long time. Walt did not know how long. Long enough that the cold reached his hands, and his bad knee set up its ache, and he ignored both. He looked up into the amber, and the amber looked down into him, and Walt understood that he was being decided about, that the thing was running its own ladder of reasons.